After failing twice at building us a dining table, it's time to finally get to work on making one that's not too big, not too small, but just right. I started the build by breaking down some massive 8/4 walnut into rough lengths for the tabletop. Because rough lumber tends to have a little bit of tension in it, I almost always make these cuts with the jigsaw. And the comment section always blows up asking why. Yes, it's slow, but I don't have to worry about the blade getting pinched and kicking the saw back at me. Run a circular saw through the thick lumber, and yes, I know, I intentionally push the blade off perfectly straight path, and the blade can get jammed up. With a jigsaw, you just blow through the material and don't really have to worry about anything, other than smashing your toes. Watch out for those little guys. Since this is rough lumber, I need to mill it perfectly flat and straight. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that I don't own a joiner, so to flatten the first side, I need to utilize a planer sled. Basically, we know that the melamine sled is perfectly flat, so I can hot glue my rough lumber onto the sled, use some shims to balance out any high spots, and then run it through the planer. This will establish a perfectly flat side of the board. It just takes a lot longer than my joiner would. Once that board comes through the planer, make sure to use your most expensive chisel to peel off all of the hot glue. You don't want all that stuff getting caked inside your planer.
Now I know that there are going to be a ton of questions about this hot glue and sled method when it comes to milling lumber without a joiner. So instead of cluttering up this video with another explanation, I've already made an entire video telling you everything you need to know about milling lumber without a joiner, and I'll link that down in the description below, but for now, let's just move on.
Now that one side is perfectly flat, I can flatten the other side and bring the boards down to their final thickness. Those edges are still super rough and nowhere close to being straight, and again, I do not own a joiner, so I employed my track saw for this task. There are a million other ways to do this without a joiner. I've even made a video about how to do this with a router, which I'll link down in the description below, but this is probably the fastest way I have access to for boards that are this large. Just make sure that you do use a dedicated ripping blade on your track saw if you're going to do this, because this is 8/4 lumber and you're going to be removing a ton of material at once. And finally, the final step to milling the boards for the tabletop involves running the straight edge that I just established with the track saw against the table saw fence to rip a perfectly parallel edge on the opposite side. Seemed like there were a lot of P's there. Now with long boards like this, it's often helpful to utilize a feather board to hold the piece flat against the fence. This just ensures that the cut stays perfectly straight. With a tabletop this large, I had to move everything to the floor since my workbench is nowhere near large enough. Those jointed edges on all the boards met up perfectly, but I marked out a triangle after arranging the boards exactly how I want them so that when I glue them up, I don't accidentally move the boards out of position. And while I am down here, I also marked out tons of lines where I'm going to use some alignment aids to get these boards perfectly matched up during the glue up.
So with those boards finally milled down and ready to go for the tabletop, you 100% could just glue all these pieces together. Although with these boards being so long and this tabletop being so big, I'm a little bit worried about getting those boards perfectly lined up with each other when I go to glue them up. And while this is 100% not a requirement to build this dining table, I'm going to employ the help of my domino.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
That way I can put tenons in between all of my pieces to make sure that my boards are perfectly aligned.
Again, you do not need a domino to do this project whatsoever. You could use biscuits, those Rockler beadlock tenon things, or dowels, which I've shown in many videos in the past to do this exact same thing. This is just a much faster process that allows me to complete the project faster so I can get this video out for all of you beautiful people to watch.
If you've never attempted to do a glue up with this many boards all at one time that's this large, it can be a little stressful. So instead of me trying to glue all 5 boards up at one time, I'm going to do 2 separate glue ups. One glue up is going to be with 3 boards, and then the other glue up is going to be with the remaining 2 boards.
I started out by inserting the dominoes into all the mortises and noticed that I don't bother gluing them in place. That's because I am not using the dominoes for strength purposes, rather just using them to ensure that everything is lined up properly and there are no big ridges between the boards. And that is what I meant by large glue-ups being awkward. It takes more time than you think to get these large pieces settled in place, and I don't want to risk the glue setting up before I get everything clamped together. Pro tip: make sure to alternate your clamping pressure on the bottom and the top of your board to prevent bowing. And pro tip number 2, use clamps on the very ends of the boards to make sure that those are perfectly level too. To make your life much easier, try to clean up as much of that glue as you can with a damp rag before it dries.
Ooh. And with one stressful glue up out of the way, now hopefully the smaller one should be a little bit easier. But boy, am I glad that I did not try to do all 5 of these at once. That would have been a nightmare.
I popped in a few more dominoes, applied an ample amount of glue to the boards, and then clamped all the boards together. Now, a keen eye would notice that I violated my own pro tip about alternating the clamping direction. No need to fear, I noticed my stupidity once I started wiping up all the extra glue and adjusted the clamps before letting these sit overnight. And yeah, building dining tables requires a lot of clamps.
Oh, regardless of whatever voiceover Eric told you, do not attempt to do this glue up all in one stage because this is crazy. But I'm gonna let this sit overnight and gonna go out and celebrate my girlfriend's birthday, so we'll deal with this later. And I'm back. Got some Italian food, nice glass of wine, and let's get these clamps off and get that final tabletop glued up.
Doing panel glue-ups like this has a tendency to get glue all over your clamps, but if you wipe just a touch of paste wax on the clamps every few months or so, the glue basically never sticks to them and will leave your clamps looking fresh for years to come. And be careful moving these panels around with these clamps on them because they get super heavy super fast. Now with both of those individual glue-ups done, I need to combine those 2 pieces together to make that one large tabletop. A few more dominoes, and yes, Crocs are fantastic as a woodworking shoe.
Guys, if you ain't crocking, you ain't rocking.
Well, let's hope this glue up's a little easier. Here we go.
And after applying glue, I tried my best to get all the dominoes aligned, but I was really struggling with how heavy these boards were, so I popped them up on their side to get the job done.
There it is. There we go. All right, now
Then I could worry about getting the clamps on, so worried in fact that I forgot to check that my camera battery was just about to die, but I think you get what happened here.
All right, so the tabletop's set up overnight and it's looking pretty solid. But before I go and worry about sanding all the glue off to make sure this tabletop looks perfect, I actually have to fill a couple small knot holes. So while they're definitely not a huge deal, I do have 2 holes, one being here and here, that I definitely need to fill with something. Now, you could absolutely just use something like black CA glue with some activator to speed it up. However, my preferred method is to take some epoxy and tint it black. That way it is rock hard.
Oh, no, not that. Just come on, you guys, let's do it.
Pro tip. Man, I'm giving a lot of pro tips out this video. To prevent the epoxy from spreading out and making a mess, I surrounded each of the holes with a dam of hot glue. And speaking of epoxy, I'm using some of this Total Boat High Performance, which is absolutely foolproof because of these pre-measured pumps. Just 1 pump of hardener and 1 pump of resin, and you've got the perfect ratio. I also add in a small amount of this black pigment stuff, give it a good stir, and you've got yourself jet black epoxy without that horrible looking neon sparkly crap that a lot of people put in. Simply pour the epoxy in all the voids, and you can see how the hot glue holds it in perfectly so it doesn't spread all over the table. Now there will be some small air bubbles in the epoxy, but a heat gun solves that problem very quick. The epoxy takes about a full day to cure, and then I came back with a putty knife just to pry off that hot glue. This does take a little bit of work, but it's super satisfying to peel it off in one solid chunk. Hands down, This is by far the worst part of the project, and that's sanding this massive tabletop. If you're looking into doing this with any kind of frequency, I highly recommend looking into one of these Rotex sanders. Festool is not a sponsor and has never paid me a dime, but holy cow, this thing makes sanding insanely fast. I was able to flatten all of the epoxy and remove all of the excess glue from the multiple glue ups in just about 5 minutes on this whole tabletop using 80 grit sandpaper. And yes, I got a Festool dust extractor too, but it didn't show up at this point in the project.
Now that all the glue seams between the boards are all flattened and the tabletop looks awesome, we're gonna bring it down to its final size. These ends are pretty rough still, so the first thing I want to do is cut these ends off so I can get the table down to its final length.
Since I know that the long edges of this tabletop are perfectly straight, I can use a large square to mark out a perfect 90-degree angle on the table's edge. This obviously won't fit on my table saw or miter saw if you own one, so the simplest way is to use a circular saw and a straight edge. A scrap of plywood, box level, or some random piece of aluminum that I had laying around is the perfect thing to run your circular saw against to get a perfectly straight line to cut. Just make sure that that straight edge is perfectly square with the edge of your table and clamp it down so that it doesn't move. Even with a super powerful circular saw, you're going to want to slow down and spend all of your time focusing on keeping it pressed firmly against that straight edge and not really worrying if a scrap almost takes out your camera. While that does work great, if you're doing this in any kind of production environment, using a track saw with a built-in square works exactly the same, just saves you a boatload of time with the setup.
Now, both of those methods of cutting the table down to its final length are totally viable, and the reason that I wanted to show you both the straight edge and the circular saw and the track saw method was just to try to make this a little bit more approachable for anyone at home that wants to build this table for themselves.
Now, one pro tip I do want to share is that crosscuts, cutting across a board, will just about always guarantee that you get some sort of tear out like this. Ideally, I would run it through my table saw to trim it to final width, but mine only goes to 30 inches, so I'm going to take a light pass with the track saw again to dial in the final table dimensions and get the edges perfectly crisp. Like this. Nailed it.
So with the tabletop cut down to its final size, you could definitely just leave it like this. However, for my personal opinion, this tabletop looks a little too thick, but I want the sturdiness of the thick tabletop. So I'm going to use this huge 60-degree chamfer bit. That way I can get a nice modern bevel on the underside of the table and just kind of lighten up the look a little bit.
This is by far one of my favorite edge profiles to put on the underside of tables. And since this tabletop is way too large to try to run across my router table, I grabbed my handheld router, chucked up the bit, and dialed the speed way back to make sure things were running safely. Because this bit is so large, it removes a ton of material at one time, so you definitely need to make many passes with it. It also kicks up a boatload of dust, so I tried using this dust collector attachment for the router, but it was basically useless and just got in the way. So I bit the bullet and sprayed that walnut sawdust all over the garage, making a massive mess, and I worked my way down to the final depth of the profile.
After I put that big chamfer on the bottom edge of this table, I went ahead and worked my way all the way up through all my grits with the sanding progression, and then I cleaned all the dust off with a little bit of mineral spirits. I think I stuttered there. I meant mineral spirits. And while the mineral spirits finish flashing off, I'm gonna mix up some hard wax oil, and I'm actually gonna finish the underside of the tabletop now just because I think it's gonna be a lot easier.
I'm going to go into more detail about this whole finishing process later on in the video, but I am using a product called vesting. It's basically the exact same thing as Rubio Monaco, where it's a two-part finish that needs to be measured out and mixed together. And if you want to try this stuff out for yourself, there is a coupon code down below, and I don't get a dime from it, and they've never paid me anything, but give it a shot if you want to try it. All you do is mix up the oil and the hardener into a cup, stir it up real nice until everything is evenly distributed, pour it all over the surface of your table, spread it out with a little plastic spreader, and actually I'll just hit that later in the video. Let's just keep things moving.
So this is gonna be where I wanna stop with the tabletop for right now. I still have to do the top side of the table, finish that, as well as the edge profile on the top. However, this thing is heavy and kind of difficult to move, so I'm gonna leave this upside down and focus my attention on the base now.
That's the beauty of this hard wax oil finish. I can literally just leave it hanging out in my dusty shop and I've got nothing to worry about while I move on to making the base for the table. I didn't show it since it felt pretty redundant, but these pieces for the base were also milled using the exact same strategy that I described earlier, but they're just a little bit thinner. I guess before I go too far, even though we're like 15 minutes into the build project already, I should mention that I do have step-by-step plans with every single detail possible to help you build this table on my website, and that's linked down in the description below. You can see a black and white rough draft of the plans right next to me as I work out the details of cutting these tapered legs for the base, and yes, for everyone outside of North America, they're also in metric. So that white line indicates where I'm going to cut these leg blanks to create the tapered legs.
So with those tapers marked out, a cut like this might look a little difficult, but I have a super easy way that I want to show you how to make these cuts.
You could absolutely buy or make some sort of permanent tapering jig, but I hate clutter, so every time I need to make a cut like this, I just make a new jig. First, grab a scrap piece of plywood or MDF and run it through your table saw, trimming off just a touch from the side. Now, do not touch your fence, just leave it alone. Back at the workbench, I know that this edge is perfectly lined up with where the blade will cut on my table saw, so I can grab my oversized leg blank and align the cut marks to the edge of the sled, both at the back and at the front. To make sure that nothing moves, I'll first clamp the piece to the sled before screwing in a few scrap blocks to ensure that the position here is perfectly repeatable. Then, to hold the piece on the sled while I run it through the table saw, I used a few offcuts to make a bridge clamp kind of thing. I think that's a technical term. Now, the piece is securely held to the sled, and since I didn't move the fence, I know that the saw will cut exactly where I want it. All it takes to reuse this setup to get perfectly identical pieces is to back off the screws on the bridge, slide in the offcut, making sure to rotate it 180 degrees of course, then tightening it back down before running it back through the table saw. Remove it from the jig, and you've got yourself 4 perfectly identical tapered legs. The plans for this project call for an angle to be cut at the top of each leg, indicated by this white section here. You've probably noticed already that I don't use my miter saw. In fact, I got one and it might have been the worst saw I have ever used, so I rely on my miter gauge for these kinds of cuts. Just set the gauge to 15 degrees and slowly start sneaking up on that line that we marked earlier. Yes, this might seem like overkill, but it really helps take the guesswork out and ensures that you're much more accurate than just throwing the piece at the saw once and hoping you hit your mark. With that top 15-degree angle cut on the legs, I also need to cut a 15-degree angle on the bottom of the legs to ensure that these legs sit flat on the ground. This, however, needs to be cut by flipping the miter gauge to the opposite 15-degree angle. Again, if this seems slightly confusing at all as you're watching the video, the plans for this project are crystal clear about all the angles and measurements that you need to make sure that your table goes together perfectly. See, the legs have a taper to them and then come up at a 15-degree angle. Neat!
Although these legs might look a little difficult to make, hopefully those tips help showed you that a leg like this really isn't that intimidating. And now we can take a little bit of a breath and work on milling some super easy rectangular stretchers for the table, and then we can get to the more complicated part of this build.
The stretchers going around the underside of the table are a little bit over 2 inches wide, not with any fancy tapers, so I can easily rip them on the table saw. And I'm going to start out with these 2 longer stretchers. To make sure that they join to the legs properly, I tilted my blade to 45 degrees. And because I was getting a little bit of tear out, I threw a sacrificial piece of MDF on my miter gauge before cutting a 45-degree bevel on the end of each piece. I want these pieces to be exactly the same length, so I clamped them together before cutting that mating 45-degree bevel on the opposite side. Next, I can repeat basically the exact same steps to cut the stretchers for the shorter sides of the base.
That's how fast life happens. And sorry to scare you, but that's truly how fast and unexpected events in your life can occur. And that's why I partnered up with Policy Genius to sponsor this video. I just got engaged, which has got us thinking a little bit about how we can future-proof our finances and have peace of mind that if something were to happen to one of us once we're married, the other person has a little bit of a safety net to cover expenses. And that safety net is life insurance. Policy Genius was built to modernize the life insurance industry. Their technology makes it easy to compare life insurance quotes from America's top insurers in just a few clicks to find the lowest price. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $25 a month for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer coverage in as little as a week and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Their licensed agents work for you, not the insurance companies. That means they don't have an incentive to recommend one insurer over another, so you can trust their guidance. There are no added fees and your personal details are private. No wonder they have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Your loved ones deserve a financial safety net. You deserve a smarter way to find and buy it. Head to policygenius.com/Spencley Design or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you can save. Now that your family is protected, let's get back to building that dining table. So with all the legs and the stretchers cut down, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So I want this stretcher to connect to the leg right about here, so it makes this angle here. A joint like this might seem a little bit complicated because there's no way you can really drive screws in or anything like that, but I want to show you a couple different options. Now, quick warning, these are super rough mock-ups to show you all the different possibilities for this joint, so don't judge me on my skills. The first option I'd suggest is just taking a drill, drilling through the joint, and then plugging it with some dowels. You could definitely use some sort of contrasting wood to really spice things up if you wanted to. Now, the second option, which I think looks a lot better, would be using some simple dowels. So you drill some holes in the leg, insert the dowel, and then you also drill some holes in the stretcher, and then like that, you can connect them together. That way everything is hidden and it just kind of looks better. And there are tons and tons of other options like mortise and tenon and all kinds of stuff like that. But the method that I'm gonna use so I can get this project done and get this video out for you to watch is I'm gonna utilize my domino.
No! God, please, no! No!
The domino is effectively the exact same thing as the dowels, and that it just slots right on top and gets you a nice, strong, secure connection. The only difference is that this is a little bit faster, more convenient, and a little bit more consistent. But you definitely do not need this thing. So like I showed you earlier, the stretcher is gonna connect to the leg like this. And then I'm gonna flip the leg up like this at a perfect 90-degree angle so I make sure that the joinery is perfect.
To keep that piece held in place, I glued together some scraps of MDF, then drilled some holes in it that allowed me to clamp the stretcher to it securely. Now, if I took my domino and just plunged it in like this, you can see that it would plunge through the stretcher, which is not what I want to do, but if I raise it up, I can plunge into a thicker part of the stretcher. To hold the domino up at a consistent height, I just set a scrap piece of plywood under the plate and it gives me a perfect plunge height. Now, the joinery process is super simple. Just make one plunge horizontally into the stretcher with that plywood riser block underneath the domino, then flip the riser block 90 degrees and plunge the domino vertically. After removing the clamps and inserting a domino, wait for it, the joint fits together perfectly.
Boom!
To be 100% honest, before even starting this project, that one single step was what I spent hours contemplating how to do. I made digital models, sent it to a few friends on Instagram, and even researched the joinery method on Google. The result was kind of mashing together a handful of ideas until I came up with this solution. But honestly, this is the type of problem solving that keeps me motivated and interested in the woodworking craft. Whenever I build anything, I always try to set a goal to learn or try a new technique and broaden my skills. I failed many times trying to do this joint and scrap pieces, but in the end, I found a solution that worked perfectly and super rewarding.
This thing actually goes together really well, and I'm impressed. It was really challenging, but still fun to do and just try something new. So I have not added any glue to this joints, I just put everything together with a dry fit, and that's because I want to now focus on putting some interior stretchers in. Now yes, the exact measurements for these pieces are listed in the plans, but chances are when you have these tapers and miters and everything like that, these pieces are not going to fit perfectly. So what you need to do is something called referential measuring. And that's where you first cut your pieces oversized and then set them down exactly where they're going to go and mark where they need to get cut. I don't care what that measurement is, just as long as it fits perfectly in between these two pieces.
Whenever possible, try to set up something like a stop block on your miter gauge to ensure that all of your pieces are cut to the exact same length. Like I said earlier, at this point in the project, it doesn't really matter too much what the length of these pieces is supposed to be in the plans. I've cut so many angles that I truly didn't even bother to look at the dimensions in the plans now. Instead, I use referential measurements to mark where the pieces needed to be cut. The first cut was slightly too big, so back at the table saw, I nibbled off just a hair until I got a perfect fit in between those outside stretchers.
And while the table is flipped over, I'm gonna take a little bit of white chalk and go and cover all of the edges that I wanna hit with a round over. That way I don't hit any that are gonna be touching the tabletop and make a mistake.
I'll get back to the routing in just a minute, but right now I want to focus on the joinery for these interior braces. This is probably irrelevant, but I started out by evenly marking from each side where I want the braces to land. You will never see this unless you're underneath the table, but the perfect symmetry is honestly kind of satisfying to me. So I want the braces to go here and here. And again, I'm going to use dominoes, so I marked out roughly where the mortise needs to go. Just like earlier, I'm going to use that same folding trick that I showed you, but this one doesn't require any fancy jigs or spacers. Just make one horizontal plunge and then one vertical plunge. Easy.
Because the edges of a lot of these pieces are pretty sharp, I put a round over bit in my router and I'm going to ease over all of the edges.
I built this router table extension a few months back and it's been a massive space saver. I made 2 full-length videos that include free plans that I'll link down in the description that walks you through every step of building this thing. You can easily use the methods talked about in those videos to make a router table extension for any table saw that you might own. When doing a large roundover like I am here, don't try to do it all in one pass. Instead, remove about 3/4 of the material on the first pass, then raise the router bit up just a hair to remove that final amount of material. I find this really helps prevent chipping and tear out.
With all of those pieces rounded over on the edges, I want to share a quick sanding tip. Whenever I see anyone sanding roundovers like this, they usually do one of these tricks where they try to get the sander to perfectly match the contours. And if you've ever tried that, you know that it doesn't work very well. The solution? Buy some of these really cheap foam interface pads that go on the bottom of your sander. You can put 1, 2, or even 3 to perfectly match the contour of what you're looking to sand, and then you place your sandpaper on top. And now back over at your piece, you can see that that foam will contour around that edge, allowing you to get a perfectly sanded piece.
I think a 5-pack of these interface pad things was like $10, but I'll leave a link in the description down below if you want to check them out. Now that everything for the table base is all sanded and situated, it's time for the glue up. And to make sure that there is proper clamping pressure, I use these clamping blocks that I made, oh my gosh, like 2 years ago to draw perfect pressure across the joint. They're basically just pieces of plywood with some sandpaper glued to them, and I use them on tons and tons of projects. And I'll leave a link to that video down in the description below too, because these things are worth their weight in gold. To make this glue up not as stressful, again, I'm going to separate it into multiple sections. First, clamping the 2 longer stretchers in between 2 sets of legs and letting that stuff dry. Second, I added in those interior braces, and to make sure that they were perfectly square with the long stretchers, I used these right angle clamping block thingies before pulling the joint in tight. Third, I added the short stretcher to the legs, and this angle really shows how helpful those clamping blocks are. Perfect pressure across the joint every single time. Also, don't forget to wipe up the glue squeeze out with a damp towel here. Getting the glue off later will be a real challenge, especially with those miters. And once that all cured, I could finally glue both of those larger sections together. Sure, this took a super long time to separate it out into so many different parts, but it wasn't stressful at all, and I wasn't racing against the clock, having glue set up on me before getting the pieces together. The next day, I removed all the clamps and flipped the base upright because I haven't talked about how I'm going to connect this to the tabletop.
So with the base finished, I know that now all you want to do is throw some oil on this and then screw this into the bottom of the tabletop. But with a tabletop this large, it 100% is going to expand and contract with the seasons. So I need to use a way that allows me to connect that tabletop to the base, but still allows for a little bit of expansion and contraction. So what I'm going to use are these little guys here, and they're called figure 8 fasteners.
I find that these are one of the easiest ways to attach tabletops. Just grab a Forstner bit that is slightly larger than the figure 8 fastener and chuck it up in your drill. Then, drill out a small area that's biased towards one of the edges of the interior braces. Afterwards, drill a small pilot hole for the screw to make sure that you don't split that interior brace. Now you can drive the screw in to secure the figure 8 fastener, and you can see that it is freely able to pivot side to side. With the fasteners attached to the base, I carried the base over to the tabletop and aligned it to the dead center of the table. Using one of those fancy self-centering drill bit things, I can drill where the mating hole in the tabletop needs to be drilled out. I'm going to use some threaded inserts that allow the tabletop to be attached and detached whenever I want, but here's a pro tip. To prevent tear out, start the drill bit spinning backwards, then go forwards until you reach your final depth. It will give you a much cleaner hole. I added some painter's tape at the bottom of each threaded insert to prevent anything from getting inside of that insert, and then added a touch of CA glue into the hole. This will give an extra layer of holding power for the insert once it's inside of the table. Also, don't buy those cheap threaded inserts. You want the ones with the hex drive like I have here, as they are 100 times easier to install. Now I can thread in that bolt and remove it as many times as I want.
So I've got the base all oiled up and put together over there, and now I want to focus my attention back on finishing the tabletop for the dining table. If you recall from earlier, I already put that big under bevel on the underside of the tabletop, and now I want to do a little bit of edge treatment to the top. So in order to draw a little consistency between the tabletop and the base, I'm going to use that same roundover bit that I used on the base on the edge of the tabletop.
Edge profiles are entirely up to you and your style. I gave a few samples to my girlfriend, and this is the one that we mutually agreed looked the best. This also gave me another chance to try out that dust extraction for this router, and it was still awful. This thing seems like a complete waste of money. I did have a few folks on Instagram suggest taping off this open section, which definitely did help, but that seems like a pretty crappy solution, to be honest with you. I think if I really want to get better dust collection for my handheld router, I'm going to have to upgrade once this one dies. But for now, I'll just deal with the massive mess.
Now that I have that edge profile routed on the tabletop, I'm finally ready to finish this. And finishing is something I usually skip over, but I've gotten a lot of questions recently about how to finish furniture, so I want to dive into that. Now, when it comes to furniture like that, I've really gotten away from using those film finishes like polyurethane and instead switched to using hard wax oil. Now, the exact product that I'm using is the Vesting 1 coat, but it's pretty much the exact same steps if you're applying Rubio.
Before I add any finish to the table, I have to quickly hit everyone's favorite topic, sanding. I use a pencil to mark up the surface of the tabletop so that I have pencil marks everywhere. This will allow me to gauge my process as I sand, so that I sand everything evenly and don't concentrate too much time in one spot, resulting in dips in the tabletop. No one wants that. I also do all my rough sanding at 80 grit much earlier in the project, so I'm going to start with 120 grit here. I slowly and methodically work my way evenly across the tabletop until all of the pencil marks are completely removed. Next, I lightly mist the tabletop with just some plain old tap water. Once this dries, it raises the fibers on the tabletop and gives it a fuzzy kind of feeling. Don't be alarmed though, I still have more sanding to do. So I'll repeat the same steps as before, marking the tabletop up with some pencil until it's evenly marked up. Then I can move up to 150 grit, doing the exact same boring thing of sanding the table evenly and methodically. And once that's sanded perfectly, guess what? I'll repeat it all over again. First, water popping the table, letting the water evaporate and raise the grain, drawing all over the table some pencil, and then moving up to my last and final grit, 180. At this point, I recommend taking a nap while sanding. It's a similar sound to trying to sleep on an airplane. It's really nice. And now you are done sanding. Just kidding. It's time to water pop the table one more time, wait for it to evaporate, and then sand the table with 180 grit for a second time.
All right, now with all of that sanding done, you're probably thinking that it's time to just slap the oil on there. The problem is that even if you have a really good dust extraction system, there's still gonna be dust all over your table. And the easiest way to get rid of all that stuff? Mineral spirits.
I promise, this step is not as bad as the last one. Just pour some mineral spirits onto a cheap shop towel and wipe it all over the table. As you can see from wiping a small corner, all the brown on the towel is walnut dust, and we want to remove all of that before applying the oil. This step goes pretty fast, but keep checking your progress by flipping the rag over and checking for dust. This stuff flashes off pretty quick, but a fan definitely helps decrease the time it takes. After one wipe down, repeat the mineral spirits bath again, and you'll notice much less dust on your rag. Again, let it all flash off and give it another wipe down with more mineral spirits. This time, there should be virtually no dust on the rag, and after all of the mineral spirits flashes off, we can move on to the fun part, oiling. Like I said earlier, I'm using this vesting single coat stuff, but it's literally the exact same thing as Rubio. I used 6 parts of oil measured out with a syringe and squirted it into a little mixing bucket. And then I used a smaller syringe and grabbed 1 part of hardener. These syringes make sure that you do have the proper mixing ratio, and they also keep from getting a bunch of junk stuck on the seals of the cans, causing them to just dry out and you wasted a lot of money. After a nice solid mix, I grabbed one of these plastic squeegee spreader thingies that are real soft and flexible. I poured the oil all over the table and started spreading it around with the squeegee thing. And I know, this oil is expensive, but seriously, look how little oil I used for this entire tabletop. It was maybe 1/3 of a cup. I think that's like 75 milliliters for you metric folks, and you literally can't mess this up. After it's pretty evenly spread out with the squeegee, I grabbed a small piece of this white Scotch-Brite pad and started working the oil into all the pores of the wood, paying attention to any potential dry spots. It is going to look a little bit streaky, but you want to let this sit for about 5 or 10 minutes. Don't touch it, just leave it, maybe get a quick snack or something. Once the time is up, grab some clean shop towels and start wiping all of the excess oil off of the table. You can see how much of it is picked up by the towel here, so keep grabbing new towels and gauge your progress. This is definitely a step that you do not want to skimp on, because any excess oil left on the table will become a sticky, gummy mess, and we definitely do not want that. Once you can wipe the table down with a towel and get no oil showing, you're all set. Oh, and safety tip here. Do not crumble these towels and throw them in your trash can. This oil can spontaneously combust, so leave them laying on the floor flat to dry. They'll get really hard and crusty, like when you're younger and you had that. Never mind.
Now after about 24 hours, the finish is dry to the touch and you 100% could be done here. However, I personally feel that this finish looks a little bit too matte, a little too flat, so I'm gonna bring it up to more of a satin finish.
So this is where that whole monocoat thing is a lie. I grabbed a maroon Scotch-Brite pad and started abrading the surface of the table, looking for that nice, even, hazy, dusty look. But doing this by hand is a real pain in the tuchus, so I slapped the pad on the bottom of my sander and started working my way across the entire tabletop. I gotta say, I love it when I think of a smart idea. The goal here is to get a super nice and even haze. This pad is super gentle, so you really don't need to worry about spending too much time in one area. It's really highly unlikely that you're going to cause any giant dips in the surface. And yes, I abraded the edges off camera too. I just figured you didn't want to see any more sanding. You've seen enough, right?
With the surface abraded with that red Scotch-Brite, I know there's a little bit of dust on here, so you're thinking, grab some mineral spirits to clean it all up. And no, don't do that. Since there's already finish on the table, the mineral spirits is gonna mess with the finish, so just take a clean cloth and just wipe all the dust off as best as you can.
There really shouldn't be too much dust at this point, but try to get off as much as you possibly can. In these shots, you should be able to see where I've wiped off the residual dust, and I know this seems tedious, but if you want a really good finish, this is kind of what you need to do. Just keep working your way across the entire table until your rag is nice and clean.
And yes, now it is finally time to put that second and final coat of oil on the table.
I followed the exact same steps as before, where I spread the oil out with the squeegee thing and then abraded it with a white Scotch-Brite pad. Again, wait that 5 to 10 minutes and grab yourself a nice snack. Then come back with a clean towel and work on wiping off all of that extra oil. And if you're lucky and working during a massive heat wave like me, maybe you're lucky and your power will get knocked out too. But that won't stop me from pulling out my phone and keep working in the dark. 2 days later, once the power finally came back on, you can see the table has just a touch more sheen to it and it's not as flat as it was before. Now let's see how this all comes together.
Back inside, Mandy and I got the table set on top of the base. Of course, a high five was appropriate now that we actually had a dining table that was the proper size. Underneath the table, I used this cute little impact driver to throw in some bolts through those figure-8 fasteners from before to hold the tabletop on top of the base. Man, those threaded inserts sure make things super easy. After 2 failed attempts at making a dining table, this one is finally the proper size for our apartment. As a reminder, if you want to pick up plans to make this table for yourself, check out the link in the description below.